Well, that was some amazing stuff. So, like loads and loads of questions I've got. I'm just conscious a little of time to get the audience in quite quickly. It's something that struck me right at the beginning when Joe was talking, and just something really for both of you straight away, was this rejection of the word sculptor in favour of making sculpture or other ways about thinking about a kind of professional identity. So really, I guess first for you, Natalie, it's about the status of that word, or that term, and about forms of self-identification as a sculptor or not.
Yeah, I think I'm often quite struck by what Griselda Pollock says about putting women artists or women sculptors together, as if that then becomes a separate category, or perhaps even a category that can be judged less favourably with sculptors who happen to be men. So I think we have throughout used the term sculpture by women wherever possible. So I think that has been very important to us from the beginning.
Yeah, and I guess I've got to follow up with I might just throw out to the audience a bit later. I was thinking about, is there, maybe you've got some thoughts, both of you, something also about how these artists are navigating a particular world of avant-garde production. I just wonder if we went into the records of the Royal Society of British Sculptors, would we find different narratives for how women have negotiated a kind of different sort of set of professional expectations and practice. That's a question I don't know the answer to now, but I was thinking about working in a particular world of being avant-garde or at the cutting edge or making kind of challenging work. There's obviously another kind of load of sculpture that's being made all the way through this period by people who would be operating in a different kind of organisation.
Yeah, I think certainly from the work that I've been looking at in the Arts Council collection, I think around the 1960s into the 1970s, women are at the vanguard of changing the materials and the references in their work, which does ultimately influence men. And Joe referenced the quote about Reg Butler making derogatory remarks to Villa de Barlow, and she actually talked about that with George Fullard, and he said, well, he doesn't understand where this is going, and actually, women's practice will lead the way eventually, and that really helped Phillida to frame her confidence, really. I think that confidence is something that comes out through the interviews that Hilary and Catherine have initiated, this idea of confidence, not just making headway at art school, but in those critical early years when you've graduated and operating as a young artist in a very competitive world. And it's something that Rana Begum picks up on quite a lot, and Holly Hendry. There's a critical moment where you need lots of support, but also a lot of self-confidence. And I think that many artists have found that to be quite challenging, especially if there are opposing forces around them, so to speak.
I think, in terms of Hepworth, and this is something that's drawn out in the interview with Joe and Sarah, Hepworth sort of changes her approach sort of throughout her working life, and starts off by sort of being an artist and, not necessarily a woman sculptor, but also later, reconsiders, her position in terms of maternity, her position in terms of Mother Nature, there's a kind of changeable. It's not a fixed status, and she was exceptionally good at navigating a network that was obviously predominantly led by men, and had an ability to be a chameleon that could then both navigate that world, but also provide nurture and contemplation in relation to her work as time went on.
Yeah. I was just interested in how planning to further kind of present this kind of extraordinary operation that's both now in terms of thinking about what you keep, how you show it, and all that, but just simply giving people sort of access to this world of Hepworth, which is an extraordinary, complex, large operation happening down in St Ives. Her role, not just in terms of creating sculpture, but running a whole operation. Most of the images we have of her, obviously, with her artworks and that the kind of the creative side of it, but just sort of running a employing people, organising the space, designing the space, the kind of the architectural and design aspects of it. Really just things I'd never had occasion to really think about. And just your thoughts about presenting that view of Hepworth to others now.
I mean, I think we've seen very recently new research that Helena Bonnet, for example, has undertaken in terms of thinking about patrimonial legacy and the way that knowledge transfer and the way that we present artists within national art museums and the confinement of that. Also thinking in relation and in terms of the language of period house museums and studio museums, what the confinement of that is in terms of understanding a particular view of an artist. I see that the Palais is less fixed and has all sorts of different opportunities that complements and not necessarily undermines what you see in Trewin, which is a very particular space curated and constructed with the artist, and obviously the set up as a museum just immediately after her death in and opened in 1976. But it has a pretty fixed curatorial status. The opportunity at the Palais could allow for the very, very particular local elements of that building and that history, that grassroots history, to meet with her expanding practice, on a very international level. There's specifically local and expansively international dialogues going on in that building, and in between all of that, there is all sorts of different opportunities to view the artist in a number of different ways, and how we operate that building through its other histories in relation to Hepworth, because they can't be completely negated, but how we present that and what lens comes to the fore with that, which obviously it's going to be Hepworth, but without sort of negating all of those other things. I mean, it was everything from the town dance hall to a cinema to a navigation school to a store to it has a huge rich history that's very much part of the fabric of the town. Those kind of relationships can through programming and clever kind of alignments can bring all sorts of different views to the artist, but also how we articulate and understand artist practice in the location of its making.
Great. Well, I think should throw it open now, and I'm sure people have got some questions.
A very basic question coming from that. Is it going to be open to the public at some point, and at what point, and in what way?
Definitely something that yes. In what guise? I mean, we are on the road in a climate of capital projects that's not favourable, but it's a building that will not wait. It needs attention now, and otherwise we will lose vital elements of its history. And so, I really want to start talking about it, and that it's not going off the radar. So we have to keep thinking about what value this studio has and what we can learn from it, and start researching and thinking about it and presenting it even before the visioning for how logistically we're going to manage that space, because it will have to wash its face. It's going to have to be. It can't just just it's going to, as you mentioned, it's going to have to be resourced and run and staff, and and historic building developments are the most expensive and difficult, and it's in the centre of town, and all of the again logistical issues of its redevelopment. It's going to take time to do that, so we need to get on with it. Just even the conservation management of the floor. The building surveys have given us categories of urgent, essential and desirable. And these are 1 to 2 and 3 to 5 and 5 to 10 years. Building projects can take, just even to gain funding, 5 years to get off the ground. So, we need to really sort of start moving that. I'm not here to sort of, sort of say we're going to lose this, but it's just, it has to be thought about now. It can't be, mothballed.
And I guess sort of following on from that, I know that Helena talked about the True-In studio, has done work on the True-In studio being sort of fixed in this particular time. There's a number of different photos up here of this studio. Will there be sort of a choice of it being shown at a particular period, or will it be much more flexible?
I think that's, I think, as I say, there's an opportunity to think very differently about how that operates. When True-In was acquired, it came with, a number of, significant works as part and parcel of that, and gradually practically every work in that space, studio space and garden and the greenhouse, etc., is now within the Tate collection. This is a, slightly different bag, although, obviously it has its very particular histories. I think, we need to tell the story of the relationship between the two studios, and that's absolutely key, but I think reconsider curatorially what the opportunities are. I think a lot of discussion and openness about the visioning of that, needs to happen before anything's, decided.
It's very interesting. My last question, and then I will hand over, sorry, is just the coloured screens up there that were designed by Hepworth. Do we know what they were for?
I think possibly backdrops for Sophie, backdrops for work, and yeah.
I'm guessing that I'd like to find out more about the contrast between, but you've already touched on this, there's a time lag between the incorporation of True-In and now the incorporation of the Palais de Danse. And presumably the conservation standards are very, very different it's kind of like 40 years later virtually. And yet, in a way, perhaps one was incorporated in a rather loose way, wouldn't match today's conservation standards, but in the other way, on the other hand, the conceptual content was more fixed. And now you seem to, it's almost kind of exactly opposite, that you have a much more constrained conservational environment to work within, but you have a conceptual environment that is much more expanded, which seems very interesting, but also kind of complicated for you to work through. And you've touched upon it, but could you just say a bit more about the difference between what happened when the Barbara Hepworth Museum was created after her death and the situation that you have now in terms of the standards you have to meet, but also the kind of intellectual thinking?
I think since, in the last 10 years, I would say conservation approaches to the Hepworth Museum are, have developed, and the planning around the museum and the conservation planning, is radically different to when the museum was taken on. There was a big project in 2013 that certainly reviewed how to care for an environment that is not, an interior museum that has a building management system, etc. And so, I would say that now the approach to both museums, is comparable. I think, there was Hepworth's voice very much determined what would happen with True-In, whereas that, is not something that, is perhaps guiding how we think about the Palais. That's key. And as I say, it didn't come part and parcel it hasn't come part and parcel as a ready formed museum. So that's going, that offers a certain sense of freedom. I think there's a lot of discussion again around, you know, how the presentation and the elements of Hepworth's presence in that building, you know, completes the narrative of Hepworth's story in St Ives. But as I sort of feel like I'm just kind of repeating myself, I just think that there's lots of opportunities to explore other aspects of her work, you know, again, from literal relationships to dance, you know, and her whole history in relation to dance and music, through programming, and being informed by, you know, other histories that can unlock new perspectives on her as an artist. I don't know whether, does that give you any more than, I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but maybe it's not really a question. No, I just I think, you know, that I think it's going to take some. It is a complex situation, and it's these studios are not. They're outside the remit of a conventional art museum. They're also sort of trying to fit within, you know, the kind of knowledge structures and institutional structures in a way that they don't quite work. You know, it's an oddity for Tate to have such an organised, you know, such a object or such a building. And I think, you know, it will take some rigorous thinking to think about how that best plays out.
If I could add to what you're saying, Sarah, but I think the fact that what you said about the institution of a new collection with Tate, so the material and studio practice collection, which actually means that there's going to be objects. So obviously you were saying about the Juno fancy dress, that's being come to the archive, and then there's the objects that will be left in situ. So the idea that you kind of, and that's the same with at Truin Studio, where the studio objects have now been acquired by Tate, but they're going to stay in that less environmentally controlled environment. So, so in other words, like by making a new collection, that is not the same as the archive. That is not the same as the main collection. You have this idea that there's knowledge and there's different kind of value in these items, but it's also about their situation in these particular places. So as you were saying about, you know, some of the items are still just staying there rather than being put in the archive.
Thanks. It's so, having been there for some of that process of the palette, it's great to see these photographs, and just sort of following on from Helena's point. There's a kind of danger of not being able to see the wood for the trees, isn't there, I think, that seeing it stripped more in the photographs sort of brings out, you know, how that place could lead to kind of better understanding of Hepworth's working processes. And one of the things that strikes me that will come out of that, which Truin maybe disguises, is that she's running a team of people who are making these works, not sort of single person heroically carving in the garden. But at the same time, having been through the process, there's a danger that you get lost in thinking about, you know, which of the biscuit tins are authentic Hepworth biscuit tins, and which are post-1975 biscuit tins. The family circle, I think, is it called family circle, the biscuit things? They look too recent to me.
I know. Well,
and you could go down that route of, you know, how should we maintain, you know, these tins in a, you know, salty environment, or do we focus on what we understand from this? And the other thing, actually, which I hadn't thought about much before, is that a really important part of Hepworth's life was her place in St Ives, the community,
absolutely.
her engagement with the physical fabric of the
community,
town, and actually just turning the place into a public resource. It doesn't need to be about her, could in a way be continuing, you know, something she did.
This is, I mean, you know, I think, I don't think that we would negate her presence there. That, you know, there's too many important elements like the floor and, you know, her interventions into the building, etc., that, you know, need to be preserved, and, you know, and there's a certain continuity, as you say, in relation to this being a more sort of industrial space to the domestic space of Turin Studio, and and the fact that it was fundamental to the development of her practice and bronze, and even though it was a very short period. But absolutely, in terms of programming and how the space is used, and how she was, somebody that opened her studio to the community, and certainly we would very much want it to be used by the community, and needs to be used by the community. As soon as we start talking about this in St Ives, there will be a huge amount of interest in what happens to it and how we. So we've got to go. I don't have any. I have my ideas about what could happen in that space, but I'm open to a lot of discussion, because we have to go through public consultation and various different things before we even start to move forward how we approach that.
I think this could
go
go
on.
on and on
Yeah.
and on, and will go on and
Yeah.
on, but I think there's probably a moment to draw this session to a close.
Yeah, please do, please.
Fascinating, you and Joe. Just even, I have friends in the 80s who were at art school who were experiencing those same sorts of issues. And I just thought is it turned on? Yeah. Okay. I just thought, I was going to ask you one question as well, but I just thought in terms of Hepworth, I'm just thinking, it's so interesting because we have this, going back, I'm sort of wondering what really were the reasons why Hepworth managed to be so successful at the time when she was. I think it affects the way we view her as a person, because I think of her as just such a strong force and such an amazingly strong person. But I just think it might be quite interesting, I'm sure other people are looking into this, the other reasons around the period at the time and the artists and the milieu, which were actually different from the kind of macho time in the 70s. There was a lot more intellectualism, and she was able to participate in that. So that's just the way I was sort of thinking, and I don't know if anyone is looking into that at all. And I just wanted to ask you one question just about that sort of hiatus in the 70s. Does the Art Council have a policy of kind of redressing that retrospectively or not?
Yeah, on the Hepworth front, I must confess I am not a Hepworth expert, so I would be very interested to open that question to the crowd. I think that in terms of the 70s, when artists are working in less sculptural forms, so in performance and film and video, we are collecting in that area. We've just recently restored a work by Mary Yates, which at the time was called Third Area, because it was neither painting nor sculpture, but it responds to land art and has sound and photographic content. So I am looking specifically at sculpture when I reference that kind of dearth, but that also artists were working in other areas, and that we do have stronger holdings in that area. But I think even in land art, we did a show called Uncommon Ground about 5 years ago. I think we had some work by Philippa Ekabishan in that show, but I know that Joyce Lehman at the Slade has contributed to our Breaking the Mold catalogue, and her experience of curating and ensuring representation in the 70s was really difficult. So although we do have pockets of areas, it's still a fairly weak area. And the Arts Council introduces a new policy in the 70s where it invites people to come and curate exhibitions. So you have Richard Cork curating a show called Beyond Painting and Sculpture. You have George Melly, but again, from a specific, quite a narrow demographic group, and representation in those shows is really quite poor as well. So it's across the board. It's acquisitions, it's who we're choosing to select, and it's that kind of culture. I think the institutional culture seems to be quite strong throughout the 70s, and it takes time for feminism and all those debates to filter into actual working practices. That's how I see it, and I think there's other research to be done.
Yeah. No, that's it.
Yeah.
When did the acquisition panel start being balanced, male-female?
I think it's in 1980. It happens almost overnight, and I'm not quite sure why. There's a whole PhD to be written about the Arts Council collection and its history, but I think something happens in 1980, which I think would require some further conversations with those participants. And it does seem to have instant change, which is positive, in terms of how we can move forward. Thank you. Thank you.